Good morning, good evening, and welcome back to the new era of agriculture commodity trade. Welcome to the session 3, day 2 of Commodity Week World 2026 or CWW 26. Just a visual and mic check. Neeraj, am I audible and visible?
Yes, sir, loud and clear.
Awesome, thank you. So Neeraj is my colleague, CEO of HnyB, a force behind setting up this beautiful marathon 6-day event. So talking about Commodity Week World, we started early today, this global marathon, which kicked off yesterday, but on the day 2, we dissected the massive production and consumption pivots in Asia and Pacific wheat corridor before chasing the sun westward to explore the intense geopolitical, currency, and logistical friction point across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. Now our journey arrives at the Western Hemisphere, tracking the sun to ultimate supply engine and export heavyweights of global trade. Welcome to the North and South America War Room. We call it War Room because we know that the world we are living today, war is the most definitive term which everybody uses. We have declared throughout this marathon that the agriculture value chain has crossed a critical threshold. The traditional playbooks, the one that relied on predictable crop cycles, stable freight corridors, and reliable trade alliances, have officially expired. We are no longer observing the cyclical market corrections. We are operating within a baseline of permanent structural volatility. Over the next 5 days, we are continuing this circle, and CWW 26, organized by HnyB Tech Incubations and Know Your Commodity, is presented by AgriGuru Online and is supported by Kripco Agri India, Bajrang Group International Dubai, and Bengani Group India again, along with our association partners, OATA Myanmar, Ukraine Pulses and Soybean Association, and GOPKI Indonesia. Other institution partners include Solidaridad and the World Cooperation Economic Forum. CWW 26 is moving entirely beyond the delayed data of historical balance sheets and presentation. This is an unscripted, unfiltered war room. We are here to democratize the high-stake market intelligence, mitigate the systemic risk of information asymmetry, and equip you with the foresight needed to defend your margins and ensure equity for producers and consumers alike. As a reminder, our sessions are beamed live across multiple digital assets on LinkedIn, YouTube, X or Twitter, Facebook, and our own event website. You can find the links in the comment. Let's talk about the micro view. While maize drives animal feed, fuel, and food for human beings, oilseed power the energy transition, but the wheat and rice represent the absolute baseline of global food security. They are ultimate politically sensitive commodity with a single export restriction or border closure can overnight across different continents create food scarcity. Globally, the grain balance sheet are tightening significantly. Let's look at the baseline numbers. For the 2000 okay. Yeah, for the 2006 and 27 market year, the global wheat production is forecasted at 815 to 821 million metric tons. This represents a sizable drop of 23 to 28 million metric tons compared to previous season. Meanwhile, the global consumption is outpacing the output, tracking upward of 825 million metric tons. This negative supply-demand delta is leading to restricted international trade and a sharp contraction in global carryover wheat stocks, which we are seeing tightening down to highly vulnerable 284 million tons. Simultaneously, the global rice balance sheet is operating on a razor-thick edge. Global rice production is struggling to outpace a surging baseline of global consumption, which is tracking at record highs of over 525 million metric tons. Global ending stock for rice are projected to drop to their lowest level in 6 cycles, down to nearly 165 million metric tons, with substantial amount of that parked in India. With major exporting hubs in Asia maintaining calibrated export regimes and tariff walls, the buffer stock availability to non-producing countries have become incredibly thin. It is pertinent to note here is that when we talk about wheat and rice, India itself, as per the government stock, is holding close to 130 million metric tons as the government-owned buffers. Now, when structural deficit emerge on global stage, the entire market turns its eye to the Western Hemisphere. The Americas do not just consume grain, they are fundamental guardians of global exportable surpluses. If the supply engines of North and South America stutter, destination markets worldwide immediately face a critical procurement crisis. Which brings us directly to our third panel of the day, the Americas theater, which is supply engine and is seeing crop anomalies and also challenges when it comes to the surpluses for export. Here in North and South America, the wheat and rice narratives are defined by raw production scale, weather-driven execution risks, and the logistical capability to move multi-million ton surpluses to deep water ports. Let's break down the critical Americas pressure points. First, the North American wheat powerhouse of US and Canada. The global trade sheet relies heavily on the quality and volume generated across US Great Plains and the Canadian prairies. For the current cycle, highlight a highly sensitive supply outlook. In the United States, the hard red winter and soft red winter wheat crops are continuously being evaluated against shifting weather anomalies, including drought and localized moisture deficit. Across the border, Canada's high protein spring wheat and durum output remain essential for global millers. However, generating a good crop is only half the battle. High inland rail freight costs, domestic infrastructure capacities, and draft levels on critical river system represent persistent execution risk that can skew the FOB parities overnight. The second, the South American wheat matrix is dominated by Argentina, as all of us know. As it stands, the undisputed regional wheat export engine from South America, routing massive volumes into neighboring Mercosur markets and competing aggressively in the global arena. The market is micro-tracking Argentina planting intentions. While we are seeing that to be positive, soil moisture levels are good and evolving domestic fiscal policy environment would be critical, which dictates how fast farmers release grain to the market. Concurrently, Brazil is executing a fascinating structural transformation. Historically, a massive structural importer of wheat, Brazil has scaled up its domestic production footprint across its southern and central states, attempting to march towards self-sufficiency. The shifting import dynamics alter traditional intra-regional trade flows and forces major global trade houses to continually recalibrate their South American origination book. Third, while the Asia dominates global rice volume, North and South America are also suppliers of high-quality long grain and medium grain rice to critical destination market. The US Gulf rice sector is balancing strong domestic demand against international export opportunities, keeping a close eye on water availability and energy overheads. The day of relying on lagging monthly report to make multi-million dollar procurement decisions are over. Navigating this extreme supply-side volatility requires elite ground-level foresights. We are going to extract that foresight right now. We assemble two eminent voices, one each from rice and one from wheat. Our mandate for this session remains the same. No script, no filters, pure intelligence. To our live audience, use chat, engage with the data, and prepare to rethink your coverage strategies. The market doesn't wait, and neither should you. It is time to secure our strategic edge. Welcome to the session 3 of day 2 at Commodity Week World 2026. Let's officially open the wheat and rice North and South America war room. I'm having my first guest, an eminent panelist, Angie Setzer. She is widely recognized across North America as goddess of grain, and truly the name signifies the great work she has been doing for a long time. She's a prominent market analyst and partner at Conscious Ag Consulting LLC. With over 20 years of experience in the cash grain trade, she specializes in empowering independent farmers and commercial elevators through direct marketing and risk management. She is a highly popular agriculture media contributor, celebrated for her blunt, insightful analysis of market fundamentals and real-world farm economics. It is an honor for me to be sharing screen with her. Welcome, Angie. Pleasure to have you on our event.
Thank you so much. I'm excited to be here.
Awesome. So, Angie, let's dive straight away in some very important question. So, my first question for you would be about the balance sheet. So, how do you see the wheat balance sheet of the US and the world unfolding with the stressed climate we are observing today? And in US also, we are seeing challenges. I've been seeing a lot of images, photographs from ground of the crop. And if I'm not wrong, roughly 69% of the crop is in from D1 to D4 level of drought regions. How do you see those challenges going forward?
Yeah, this year is definitely going to be an interesting dynamic overall when it comes to the balance sheet and what we see happening and what unfolds. The biggest question I feel like we have, or the biggest uncertainty, unknown, if you will, of course, is what level of demand elasticity we will see, simply because I think we have grown, and I say we, the global wheat market has grown accustomed to having access to what is, I've always said this, the US, and this isn't taking away from any other global producer in the world, but the U.S. produces a premium product. We have, pretty much any level of specification or quality that you're looking for in your wheat that really provides the rest of the world this sort of access to blendable supplies. Like we tend to forget, or maybe we don't really recognize, those of us who aren't in the trenches, if you will, aren't actually handling the physical supply of wheat in general. Wheat is one of those crops that you have a wide scale, and not only on the demand side that the end user is looking for, you also have, on the supply side, you have protein, you have falling numbers, you have different toxin levels, you have all kinds of different things that kind of pop up in wheat that really make each bushel its own specific. It's almost like a snowflake. And so one of the things that we have seen over the last several years, and one of the things that we've really grown accustomed to, having a large amount of wheat available out of the US, having our dollar under pressure and freight being cheap, is that the world's been able to kind of tap in to these supplies and really stretch what they had. Now, we've had abundant supplies, obviously around the world, but one of the things we tend to forget or maybe miss is that big wheat crops tend to come with quality issues. We saw it in Argentina, where they had the largest crop that they had ever had, but they had a significant amount of it that was actually feed wheat, not necessarily milling quality. And so for me, as we look ahead to the year ahead and what we've got going on, right now to see the market set back a little bit isn't a surprise. This is the time of the season or the time of the marketing year, whereas an elevator manager or anyone that's, kind of relying on supply to come in, you're remain somewhat optimistic. Cautiously optimistic is probably the best. If you're sitting in an elevator in Kansas, like obviously you're looking at a much smaller crop, but there's still, that little bit of hope that remains that it might be a little bit bigger than expected. I don't think it will be. I'm hearing just absolute terrible yield levels, yield results, if they're even putting a combine into the wheat in the Southern Plains. I think this is going to be one of those situations where we haven't seen a year over year decline in production potentially as large as the one that we're facing. And so, yeah, I really think in the year ahead, we're going to discover that there are much tighter supplies. And the one thing that really has my attention right now is everyone seems to be thinking that Russia is going to be the savior for the global market, but we don't have the same capacity out of Russia logistically, quality-wise, and it almost feels like we're forgetting they're currently participating in a very escalatory situation in the Black Sea as well. So it's going to be an interesting year ahead.
Yeah, so Angie, like you travel extensively, you are seeing the crop on the ground. How do you see different region of US, like when we talk about the productivity or the yield or the condition of the crop? Do you see that there is a very different, I would say, scenarios in different states? And would you like to dissect some of those regions?
Yeah, so the soft red wheat belt is in the eastern portion of the Corn Belt. So I live in Michigan, and so that's the northernmost state for soft red wheat production. I will tell you that our soft red wheat, our wheat crop, we have soft red and we do have some soft white in the state here. We handle both. Both look phenomenal. What got planted and what made it to production looks great. Now, we had a lot of really heavy rain in March and in February that reduced acres even further. We had a lot of acreage that was planted last fall. We already had smaller planted acreage already across the state, but we did have a lot that ended up going into a different crop. It almost looks as though we have a lot of sustainability programs, planting into cover crops and things like that. almost to a certain extent, it looks as though we used wheat as a cover crop last fall simply because it was so cheap locally. It was probably cheaper than any other cover crop seed you could get your hands on. And so here locally, things look good. Now, to the south, there are some issues with vomitoxin, fusarium, head scab, things like that. There's been a lot of heavy rain that has fallen throughout the month of May across portions of Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, and South. I'm hearing some horror stories of potential quality issues there, but that's your soft red wheat belt. Basically, east of the Mississippi is where we will see the majority of the wheat be soft red wheat. Michigan's the only outlier that does a little bit of white wheat in that region. Now, the southern plains is where it's problematic. You look at eastern Kansas, eastern portions of Texas, Oklahoma, places like that. There may be some optimistic production outlooks where you've seen more in the way of rainfall over the last 6 weeks or so. You move west of I-35, and that's where a lot of the really large or really significant drops in production are located. There were a lot of stories of folks across portions of the Texas Panhandle and in that neck of the woods just simply not even putting combines through the field. The Oklahoma Panhandle also in very rough shape, and a good significant amount of Nebraska is super problematic. Now you move to the northern plains, and that's going to be more of your spring wheat area, but there is some winter wheat in that neck of the woods as well. You've got some South Dakota, Montana has some winter wheat. I have a customer that I work with in Montana that has several thousand acres of wheat planted that he's hopeful could produce 30 bushel the acre, which is significantly lower than what he would like to see to be profitable at these levels currently. And so the issues, the production problems and things like that, the dry conditions are impacting the Western belt, our hard wheats, spring and winter, and then too wet is actually impacting the Eastern belt, and that's potentially causing some issues with either some fusarium, like I said, or potentially falling number issues with the rain that's expected to come here over the next couple of weeks.
So, Angie, a lot of analysts are projecting that actually we could be seeing between 15 to 20% drop in overall productivity across America on average. Do you subscribe to that idea that we can seriously have such a shortage?
I think so. I think we'll have a very large shortage, or a very it'll become problematic. I think it may not be seen quickly, it may not be seen for a short period of time, obviously, because we will have the harvest flow. We'll have an increase in grain movement here in the short term because some farmers or a lot of farmers, especially in the plains, don't have the capacity to store a significant amount of wheat. So you may have some early physical pressure, but I think this will be something that shows up very, very quickly once harvest is wrapped up and we know for sure what is sitting in the bin.
Perfect. Now we are seeing a challenge in one of the largest exporter like US, and we are seeing the sowing numbers from Australia also coming very negative. In fact, again, from 34 million metric tons, we are seeing something around, maybe we'll be lucky if we get around 26 to 27 million metric ton there. Now, when these two large exporters, right, and if we talk about top 7 exporters of wheat, we are seeing 25% dip in the availability for export. In that scenario, the prices should have shot up far more than what actually we are seeing currently. Don't you think that's a double whammy for the farmers, that on the one side you are having yield which have not been great, and secondly, generally when yield goes down, you see prices improving, but we are seeing that the funny things happening on seaboard, right? It did went up to 670, then again crash. So is this paper trade not realizing what's happening on ground?
I think so. I keep using the phrase or the word nuanced when describing agronomic, when we're talking about all of the agronomic implications, the agronomic drivers that help get to the end of yield and yield projections, production looks overall. And so, yeah, I do think that there is a lack of clarity, or there's a lack of understanding as to how we could see the overall flow of grain impacted. Now, of course, there is this idea or this feeling and this kind of continuous sort of narrative repeated that we have plentiful supplies all over, and most folks are saying that it's the farmer that's sitting on these supplies and that they will eventually move it or whatever. But that's kind of been a repetitive sort of story that I've heard without seeing it. It's kind of amazing at this point. Like we'll hear some conversations amongst, folks in Australia talking about limited movement of grain off the farm or something like that, and why that's kind of creating some gaps in supply availability. But then you look back at reports during harvest time, and several elevators across the country were reporting record receipts of wheat at the time. And so some of these things that we're seeing, don't necessarily add up, for one. For two, the narrative versus some of what you're seeing on the ground is a little bit different. I feel there is a bit of a disconnect in general. I feel the people telling the story or the big overall story about wheat sometimes may be 1 to 2 to 3, beyond that even, participants removed from the market, basically meaning that you have a lot of, analysts repeating stories that have been told to someone else and then passed through 2 or 3 other people. And we learned very quickly as children that the telephone game, you tend to have things get messed up that way. And so I do feel that there are so many moving pieces in agricultural commodities, wheat especially, that it's just not one of those things where, there's a problem, buy wheat because it needs to move higher. I think it's really one of those where it is so multifaceted, so nuanced, and so, right now, somewhat unclear as to how everything plays out. It is easier for folks to just stay on the sidelines that aren't general everyday participants in this market.
No, but frankly, whatever I'm seeing on the ground in my interaction, I see 700 to be given. Frankly, if you ask me, right, it is only sometimes what happens is that the paper trade, those who are sitting in air-conditioned rooms and running the algorithm, how many people on Twitter are having positive sentiments, negative sentiments, and the farmers, unfortunately, they are not all on Twitter. Right.
Yeah.
And then you'll be surprised. Some of the analysts, they don't even have basic understanding of agronomy. Right. So they make tall claims based on some conspiracy theory, and then they say this is going to happen. They don't even basically understand actually which season what is being grown, and then they make tall claims. I frankly, with the numbers, I'm scared. I'm scared in the sense good for the farmers for sure, but scared for the consumer part of it. That I see 700 spot. That's a sure possibility. I'm watching for that. No, but that brings a very nuanced question to you, which is the next question. According to you, how are the independent farmers adapting their direct marketing strategies to survive the extreme volatility between global futures and the local cash grain prices?
It's a very, there's a lot of variety. It depends on how they are positioned financially, especially. There's a whole different way to approach things. We've seen the easiest one is, what we saw last fall in wheat, where you just don't plant it. I have several customers that I've worked with for 10, 15, even 20 years they planted wheat. It was part of their rotation. It was what they did. In last fall, they looked at $5 wheat futures and the cost being $7.50 a bushel if you're lucky. If you're looking at good solid yields. And they just decided not to grow it. On the flip side, I am seeing others who are adding storage space. I have a handful of customers, and that is one of the biggest ways here locally, at least. We have the special VSR, the variable storage rate in the Chicago wheat contract, also in Kansas City, to where if the market structure does appear as though we have more than adequate supplies, of course, you have really significant carry built into the spreads. And so you have seen some folks be able to make pretty solid money, or at the very least not have to take the price being offered to them directly at harvest time. But there are a handful too that are looking at more specialty type products or what they're producing there. There's also some sustainability type premiums. We've seen some different entities out there on the wheat mill side of things offer some decent pennies per bushel or maybe a little bit more than that to kind of try to incentivize some additional production practices. But overall, what we're seeing is just there are a lot of farmers out there right now that are really perplexed as to how they're going to be able to continue down the path that they're on. And this isn't just a US thing. I have folks that I talk to from around the world that say the same thing. I've always argued, and we talked about this a lot throughout the COVID stretch and things like that. If you get to the point to where you can buy it cheaper on the board than you can produce it, we're in the wrong spot. We're set up wrong. And it might not be, and wrong might not be the accurate word if you want to say it that way, but it's just one of those things where currently what we're seeing is a price cheap enough that it continues to encourage demand. Well, it discourages maximum supply. And so for a lot of farmers out there right now, they are really just doing whatever they can to save the money that they can, and just praying that they're able to get to the end of the season with some type of margin, or that their government will step in with something that'll hopefully help to fill some of those gaps.
Angie, I think that is also a structural problem with agriculture. And as you rightly mentioned, it is just not about the US. If you see that the global inflation, right, over past 2 decades, compoundingly, it has grown by close to 68%, right? While you see the agriculture commodity, that growth is only 22%. So you are finding that most of the other product their price has grown by 3 times more than the agriculture product. Now, that brings a very important question about the inflation also. We are seeing the challenges in the US where the diesel cost has gone haywire, gasoline costs are pretty high. A lot of farmers, they have not previously booked the fertilizer, right? And the fertilizer price also have escalated. And at the same time, also that leads to the other byproducts, whether actually we talk about the crop protection, we talk about seeds, we talk about consumables. The prices of everything has gone up. In this scenario, is it discouraging a lot of farmers to move out of agriculture? Because in India, we are seeing number of farmers this year, because of India also have another problem, just like weather problem of El Nino this year. So you might see that actually farmer will say that, hey, this is not something, let's wait and for next 2 years, not do anything and see how things evolve. Did you think that is also some mindset being developed in farmers in US as well?
Oh, yes, definitely. A lot of folks that are of the older generation, we tend to joke in US agriculture about the age of the average farmer being, in the mid 60s or whatever. Traditionally, we would see folks farm till the end of their life. They just would farm until it was all over. You would hear an occasional retirement story or something like that. But this past spring, we did see a lot of farmers across the country just basically say, nope, that's enough. I'm going to keep the equity that I have. And I've had conversations about this, with several of the customers that I work with that may be feeling a little bit more pinched, where they're making decisions about some of the poorer land that they're farming. There are some folks there that have cut back pretty significantly on the land that they are producing or that they're working with. They're letting someone else have the opportunity, or something like that. But yeah, it is exceptionally discouraging. I had a conversation yesterday with a grower in Indiana, talking about using fungicide and the applications of fungicide, and how a lot of farmers local to him are being told that it's already time to use your first or apply your first application of fungicide at V5 on corn, and they're balking at it. It might only be $10 more an acre of cost there, but then there's the extra cost of application. There's the extra cost of all of these other things. There's just a significant amount of, I don't want to use depression because it feels so dramatic, but there's a very depressed feeling in the market as a whole. We're just towing a very fine line on trying to produce a crop to get to the end and make sure that you do have something to show for it in your business. But then at the same time, not overspending. I mean, we're talking $1,000 an acre to produce corn. Your wheat's not too awful far behind, and it doesn't have the yield gains that corn does. And so there's a lot of sort of negative sentiment out there, and a lot more in the way of why am I doing this type questions than I've heard in the past.
Perfect. So now actually when we talk about farmers getting disenchanted with agriculture, according to you, what would be the one biggest critical risk farmers see in the current scenario? Is it a high input cost, or is it like not getting the right value, or degradation of the soil? Challenges, because even if you see the yield numbers, they're tapering off. Like the wheat yields are not growing what it used to, like maybe 5 years or 6 years back. No, that is also stagnated. And then when you have weather issues, you have the real yield challenges. So what, according to you, would be top 1, 2, 3 risk pharmacy in agriculture currently?
The biggest one is a reduced production. We need to maximize yield as much as possible. And so I do feel like I'm talking out both sides of my mouth by saying the farmer is going to kind of pump the brakes on what they spend. But if weather comes into play and really limits their production capacity, that's going to be the first one. Your revenue per acre obviously is driven by futures price, but it's really driven by what you can produce on that acre. So that's my biggest worry. Second biggest, of course, is that our energy costs remain exceptionally elevated and we have a wet fall. Maybe that's a little bit premature that it's only June 2nd. But if we see a double whammy, where if you were to see a rise in natural gas prices, or at the very least, if you were to see propane and some of these other costs stay elevated, and we were to see, we've had a bit of a delayed start. Planting has been ahead of pace, but emergence and things like that have been below. And so, it's really just a continuation of high energy costs. And then, of course, lastly, if we were to see a reduction in our ability to have access to global trade, which I don't see, but it does remain something that I'm watching very closely. Obviously, is just, we've got to, like you said, the ethanol usage is stagnated in the country here. Now we can export it. We can definitely open up ethanol exports and some of these other things. But yeah, as a whole, 1, 2, 3, weather and production losses in wheat specifically, now that we're getting close to harvest, would be some sort of quality issue at the end of the season, heavy rain causing a falling number issue or something like that. But then, of course, high energy prices remaining into the fall. And then lastly, just, an overall loss of export potential.
So, and actually, we live in I would say, post-fact world, right? Everybody is on Twitter, and now, through social, right? And the macroeconomic headlines are like, talking very differently on the ground realities. And this is where I see disconnect. So according to you, what is the biggest disconnect on when we talk about macroeconomics, the large number? US inflation is going down, US is doing awesome. There would be GDP growth unseen. While I'm not taking any political side, all politicians for me are saying, right, they're as good or as bad, right?
Right.
But at the same time, do you see that disconnect between macroeconomic headlines and farm gate? What's happening exactly there? Do you see that disconnect?
Yes.
And what are those disconnect according to you?
The biggest thing I would say, the biggest disconnect is that the farmer is going to farm, or that the farmer is going to work to produce a maximum amount of supply no matter what they can. I think that's one of the bigger ones. I think the probably the biggest right now for me disconnect between the macro headlines or the big picture headlines and what is potentially happening on the ground is and I feel like I shouldn't speak too boldly about this because I am not necessarily an expert in the Black Sea, but as an observer of what's taking place, I feel like we are acting as though the situation in the Black Sea is we're just always going to have grain flowing out of there uninhibited. Like we were worried about it when the initial invasion happened, and now we've just basically become incredibly complacent. And so I feel like that's a part of it too. Like folks read or see the headlines of Russian wheat production, but don't actually understand the all of the pieces that will go into, the farm gate price, the logistical movement. Does the global buyer want to risk having all of their purchases coming out of an area like that, or something like that? And so I feel like probably the biggest disconnect out there is just that all is well and that we will always have record supply, and that demand is stagnant. When I just feel like if you're on the ground, you know for a fact the record supply has been a gift, and we've been very lucky to see it, more than 1 year in a row. The El Nino may have something to say about that here pretty soon. But then the idea that demand is stagnant, I feel like we're very much under counting or unable to really kind of pinpoint the growth and demand that we've seen, food, feed, fuel, and all of that. And I think we're definitely just kind of living over here in a world of complacency. It will always have access to food. It'll always be cheap, and those sort of things. And so I think there's a big gap there that we might be missing.
No, see, I totally agree. In fact, human beings are the most resilient species, but they are also most dumbest of species, right?
Yes.
And you rightly mentioned the Black Sea. See, the problem is that when we talk about the crisis in West Asia, it was 20 years of real war, and after that, it is actually posturing. Yes, Strait of Hormuz is closed, but it's posturing. Black Sea, Russia, Ukraine is hot war. Missiles
Yes.
are flowing every day. Even yesterday, there was a huge attack. So there are waves of attack from one side or another. And believe me, a moving truck, no drivers are ready to move cargo in both Ukraine and in Russia, in the zone where the production is happening. So you have trucks, you have fuel, but nobody wants to drive that truck because actually everybody cares for their life. And don't want to be a macho man to that to save the world and feed the world. I will be driving in a war zone. So those challenges are real. Those challenges are real, you are right, and those challenges are ignored by the headlines, right? This is when you talk to the people on the ground, right? You talk to them and you say that, hey, why the cargoes are not moving? So they say that actually we don't have drivers. No,
Yeah.
nobody's gonna tweet we don't have drivers, but that's the reality. So this is what I believe, that there is a disconnect for sure. And now coming to another very pertinent question, when we talk about the producers, right, independent producers, how they can leverage best the fundamentals, the market information to capture right margins. Are farmers using right information? Are they updated enough, or for people like you to make them updated enough so that actually they don't end up selling at the lowest possible price points and eventually not making the margins, and the margin is passed on to someone else? Do you see that farmers are now, because back home in India, Southeast Asia, Africa, and to a certain extent in Europe also, I'm still seeing that farmers are not adopting technology and data to the level where they should be. Is the same case when we talk about wheat farmers in US?
I would say, I am pretty proud of the shift in the farmer dynamic across the US. Over the last little bit here, there are a lot of growers that are far more in tune, with what is going on in the world and what is a good price to them than maybe what we've seen before. But that's still a minority amongst the bulk of producers out there. And so, the biggest things that I've seen growers do here locally that has helped, or of my customers or folks that I'm working with, is they tend to be more spread out in their sales. They do a lot of incremental scale selling, and maybe they have access to some options. Maybe they own call options, or they buy some puts if the market is higher or something like that. There are a handful of them out there. I think the biggest thing that I've seen producers do to kind of leverage their ability or their margin as a whole is to build storage space. I think I mentioned that earlier. Work to keep it out of the pipeline when the grain is flowing at its highest pace. But overall here, most of the farmers out there are still feeling run over, especially by the wheat market. Like I said before, we do cash flow, or we do cost per bushel exercises ahead of the growing season. And, basically in order to break even on wheat, you got to have 100 bushel the acre or $7. Or this year, it was almost like you had to have both. And so it's one of those things where for a lot of farmers out there, it's difficult to sell at a loss or to lock in a loss, especially when you don't know what production looks like or could look like going forward. And so, yeah, we're still fishing behind the net quite a bit, I think, when it comes to leveraging data and information and some of those other things. But I think that plays back into the nuance conversation that we had in the so many moving pieces. I think the farmer begins to feel overwhelmed, especially in wheat, because everyone around the world produces it. Everyone is harvesting. They're somewhere harvesting wheat, right? That's the old adage that we have, that someone's harvesting wheat every day of the year, which isn't necessarily true, but close enough. We have all of these different factors at play. And so I do feel like the farmer is trying, but is maybe uncertain where they need to look, or how to even tackle a market as volatile as what wheat can be.
So Angie, the last question, what would be your advice, one, to a farmer, a second, to a trader? So two advices from you.
Yeah, my advice to the farmer would be to keep your head up. This too shall pass, not to sound cliche by any means or anything like that. I do think the market has a certain amount of gravity to it, and eventually cash will show what's really happening out there, and futures will have no choice but to follow. For a trader out there, if you are an end user, looking to source supply and you have the ability to buy anything within shouting distance of what you paid basis wise a year ago, you need to get it covered, and you need to get it covered well into the marketing year if you know you have X amount of usage needed. I wouldn't wait to see if maybe we're undercounting or if we're too pessimistic on the overall production. I do feel that, if you know what you need for quality specifications, you know when you need it from a shipping standpoint, and you know that you can get it owned at a reasonable value, comparatively speaking, I would definitely work to cover some of my short on that side, simply because I don't know how this plays out. And if we're resting our hopes on Russia, providing the Northern Hemisphere with wheat for the next 6 months, we may be a little bit, it's just a scary proposition for me.
No, I totally agree with you. Any origination countries which are importing, if they are banking that the Black Sea will come as a savior, the answer is a big no, right? The numbers are shrinking. As I said, top 7 wheat exporters, the combined average availability of export would be down by 25%. That's not a small number. While definitely agencies, they don't want to spread panic. So they would underplay always whenever there is a deficit. And secondly, we definitely, because of what we have done in past 4 or 5 years, we are having pretty decent surplus. But surplus is having a bad habit, right? You only know how good it is to use, right, when you start using it. And some of the countries which are having buffers as old as 3 years, right, you will have a luster loss, you'll have protein loss, you'll have a lot of challenges. And once you dig it out from your silos, then only you know how good it is. So Angie, it was a pleasure to have you on this webinar. Straight from the heart. I always love that, your bluntness, your clarity of thought. It is pretty appealing. And as you rightly titled as Goddess of Grain of North America, I hope you continue doing the great work you are doing. Thanks a lot again for joining.
Thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Awesome. So now we move from wheat to second globally important crop, that's rice. And to talk about rice in Americas, we are having Mr. Peter Bachman, who is an accomplished policy advocate serving as president and CEO of the USA Rice Federation, the global promotional arm of US rice industry. Armed with a deep background in federal government affairs and international trade promotion, he leads national strategies to expand global market access and influence agricultural legislations. His core expertise encompasses trade agreement negotiation, tariff structures, and managing public-private partnerships to enhance the economic resilience of agriculture producer. Welcome, Peter. Pleasure to have you, sir.
Thank you for having me.
Awesome. So, Peter, let's delve into the first very important question. How do you see the rice balance sheet of US and the world unfolding with stress climate we are observing today? And we are already seeing El Nino would be having a huge impact on some of the critical producing nations in the world, especially Southeast Asia, all the way from Vietnam to Indonesia to Philippines, Thailand, India. We are seeing that challenge, while India is a little bit better placed because of the large war chest buffer, which we are having of close to 70 million metric tons of rice available in stock. But the rest of the world, I think there are challenges. And that gives also opportunity to US to be catering to some of those markets. How do you see the overall global and US rice balance sheet as on today?
Well, as you mentioned, the world has an oversupply of rice right now in most cases, maybe not in every country. And there's certainly countries throughout Africa and parts of Asia that have a rice deficit, but there's many countries within Asia and in the Western Hemisphere and Europe where we see rice surplus. And so the US had a large carryover of stocks from the 2024 crop into the 2025 crop. And now there's still much of that 2025 crop left in storage that will be carried into the 2026 season when we begin harvest here in the US in August. And so we're going to continue dealing with this oversupply situation. However, we've got the smallest crop in the ground since the 1970s this year. Typically, we have close to 3 million acres. This year, we have under 2 million acres of rice out there. And so that's going to be difficult for us to navigate moving forward. We're going to have we'll get through this year and we'll market the 25 crop we've still got on hand. We'll market the 26 crop, but there's going to come a point where we have a shortage and we're not able to satisfy either all of our export markets or our domestic market. And so we're going to see, I think, acreage come up next year, and we're going to see our prices certainly respond later this year and likely increase as a result of that short crop. When you look at the global picture, I think weather interferences around the world plus that oversupply will lead to reduced plantings in the Western Hemisphere, like we've already seen in the US and in parts of Asia, where prices are not high enough for farmers to want to grow rice. And then I think that will correct, global prices will correct themselves. They'll start to rise a bit. We've seen low prices, really, really low prices for the last year, ever since India lifted their export ban. We've seen prices kind of sunk, and we think that will start to change once the world responds to some of these weather challenges that we're up against and the oversupply. So like you said, there's opportunities out there. I think we see that too. We're going to have a tough year, but I think there will be opportunities for some companies within our sector that are going to really benefit from this and that will be well prepared. And then we'll see others that don't make it, unfortunately. But that's the way the global market works. And we've had multiple years of kind of low prices here in the US, but also with really high input costs, and fertilizer, fuel, seed, chemicals are all at kind of record high prices right now. And so that's playing a big role in discouraging rice production here in the US and other parts of the world.
Perfect. So Peter actually has a mandate for the USA Rice Federation is to market rice from US all across the world. But at the same time, we are seeing in a large number of countries which are predominantly rice importers, there is profound protectionism, right? This mindset of everybody wants to become self-sufficient in everything, right? Unfortunately, that's not possible, but actually it is good for giving bites and it makes media news. When a president or a prime minister or a leader of the state speaks up and say that from next 5 years, we will be self-sufficient in rice. We have seen that happening in Philippines. We have seen that happening in Indonesia. We have seen that happening in Benin. We have seen that happening in Nigeria. But they go back to imports, right? But we are seeing this profound protectionism. How is US Rice Federation tackling such challenges?
I think we've been frustrated by that. One country you didn't mention was Sri Lanka. That was a really bad situation for them. It was a bad experiment to say we're going to go self-sufficient, we're not going to import, we're going to grow all of our own food, and it didn't work out. And in 1 year, they switched back to becoming an importer. I think you mentioned it rightly with Nigeria. That used to be one of the US's biggest markets for parboiled long grain rice, and we've seen that shift. We see they still on paper say that they have closed borders and they're no imports, but in reality we know that there's kind of a fluid border, and there's a lot of rice that gets smuggled over the border into that country to make sure that they've got sufficient rice out there to feed their people. And so that's frustrating for us because those are all potential markets, and the US is a high cost supplier. Means that we're not going to compete. We're not going to put the local rice production out of business. When we look at countries like Cote d'Ivoire that are working on developing their own rice supply, and they'd like to become self-sufficient someday, our rice is expensive. And so if we're selling into Cote d'Ivoire, we're not going to put the local rice producers out of business with our expensive rice. We're just going to fill one niche part of the market, but countries like India come in, they sell rice at half the price or less than the local production, and they are putting countries like that out of business in terms of rice production. So what the U.S. is doing for ourselves, we've seen a lot of rice flooding into our borders. We've seen our imports growing every year up to a 257% increase over the last 20 years of rice. And so we think that we need to be more protectionist too. We're not saying that we're going to be self-sufficient because we can't grow enough basmati to satisfy our domestic needs here. And our basmati is not the same as, maybe Indian or Pakistani basmati, but we do understand that we need to do something to slow down the imports. And so we're deciding that we need to be more protectionist as well and look out for ourselves, because if we can't get into these other countries, we need to at least protect our own domestic market, because that's our best market right here in our backyard.
No, I totally agree with you. Sometimes, things go overboard where actually it start impacting the farmers directly on the ground. That also brings us to a very important, pertinent question that U.S. rice industry need resilience, right, from the global shock. You talked about India testing the prices, and I would not say that it was created with intention where the government tried to push to reduce the price. There was so much of production, 150 million metric tons. You had roughly 40 to 45 million metric tons lying in your silos and in your warehouses. You don't have place to store them because now you're having too much. So what you do, you try to liquidate at whatever best price you get. And this is where actually the price, India started becoming, there was a time actually India used to be second or third costlier from the bottom, right? Vietnam or Thailand used to be cheaper than us, but then the tables turned because of we had, by God grace, a huge production for continuously 2 years. So that led to challenge. But given this international global supply shocks, right, how do you see the role of public-private partnership playing an enhanced role? So you engage with the policymakers, right, and the current dispensation of US. They are trigger happy on tariff. Unfortunately, they were unfortunately not for the world, but for the leadership that the Supreme Court intervened. But do you think that eventually the tariffs will be playing an important role, when especially I'm saying with the context of rice, and public-private discourse need to be stronger?
Yeah, I think the U.S. rice industry has a really strong partnership with our government, both our administration, the Trump administration, and their officials, and with our Congress. Having that relationship helps us to stay in communication, share information, and if needed, we can request protection through financial assistance to help offset some of the subsidies that our competitors get out there. They help us offset potential losses due to economic situations outside of our control. So like I mentioned earlier, the fertilizer, fuel, all of those surcharges hit our farmers right at the time of planting. And so if they're going to lose a lot of money for this crop, then we'd like to see some sort of offset from our government or assistance from our government to make sure that we keep that critical rice infrastructure in place. We don't want to lose rice farmers. We don't want to lose rice mills or dryers or the trucking. It's a careful infrastructure, complex infrastructure. And just like you mentioned about India and the overproduction there and how much you've got, in your market, it's not about trying to get prices really low purposefully. That's the nature of the business. And there's so many people that farm rice in India that the infrastructure there is very important. And that's why the government is so protective of their farmers, is because they realize that they need to keep them in rural parts of India and growing rice and out of the cities and keep them being productive. And the U.S. feels the same, and we want the same for our farmers. And so we want our government to protect us enough so that our farmers stay in business, stay where they are, keep providing jobs and markets, keep providing food for our country and other countries. And I think that the tariffs are probably going to be here to stay to some degree. I don't know what form they're going to look like. We saw more proposed tariffs come out overnight from the government on a 25% proposed tariff on Brazil. And so I think there's going to be different variations of tariffs on different countries and different products. But everything is going to look a little bit different by the time we get to the end of the Trump administration. And they're going to want something that is as permanent as possible, I think. And it's going to be difficult or unpopular for future presidents of the US to say, I want to lift all these tariffs, because that means that they're going from protecting whatever US industry the tariffs are on to unprotecting them by removing tariffs. And so once they're there, it's hard to take away, because there is that general support from whatever industry you're talking about, whether it's rice farmers or corn farmers or steel workers or car manufacturers. All of them benefit from whatever tariff is in place for them. And so they're going to upset some part of the constituency if they lift those tariffs. So we'll see what happens, but we certainly think that tariffs are going to stay for at least the next 2.5 years, and probably beyond that time to some degree.
No, I totally agree. In fact, India's, I think, rice export numbers to US was close to $330 million US. Right? We are seeing that shrinking because of tariff. At the same time, as you rightly said, that some protection is definitely required. Another big difference between India and the US is that 40% of Indian working force is involved in agriculture, while that number is close to 3.8 to 4% in the US. So I would say, like, another route could be, like, giving more support to the farmers, and Trump administration as such, they don't love too much the WTO. Right. So it doesn't matter whether WTO allows subsidies or not. They can always do that. I think that is also one area which maybe, like, the Rice Federation, US Rice Federation should look at, that if not just tariff, can there be another support? But that brings us to a very important question. As you touch upon tariff, so how are shifting tariff structure and multilateral trade agreements, which US is trying to sign with different players? For example, if the bilateral trade agreement between India and US do happen, because it has been something which is being cooked for such a long time, but I'm still to eat it, right? For more than a year, we are cooking it. There is a possibility where actually, like, for Indian shrimp, for Indian rice, there could be concessions on the table. Do you think that these type of agreements, and even in fact agreement with the Thailand, Malaysia, which US did, sometime it happens that small commodities like rice slips through the cracks and doesn't seem to compromise on the larger picture? Do you think that that's also a possibility because of these multilateral or bilateral agreements?
I think that rice won't make it into the US-India trade agreement if that ever really comes to fruition. I think India is smart enough to know that they will not give any concessions on rice, probably not on shrimp either. They'd rather address those outside of the trade agreement side of things. And I think they know that there will be, big rallies and protests in India if they were to give any sort of concession. We already saw
Peter, I was talking about concession from US, because currently we are from nearly zero now for both shrimp and rice. Like, tariff has come to 15%. Do you think in negotiation US will give those concessions, allowing again nearly duty-free rice from India to come?
No, I think rice will stay. The US knows that India is, one of the bad actors on rice in the world market. And so they know enough to know that if they were to give a concession on Indian rice or Thai rice into the US through negotiations, that it would not, that's where our relationship with the government is helpful. They know that we're supporters of theirs, and they won't stab us in the back by giving a concession to, the country that they hear us talk about the most, from the rice side of things. But
no, Peter, frankly, we are not so bad actors, right? There are few compulsions, and as I said, like, 40% of your workforce, when they are into a specific type of activity, right? it's not going to be impacting few millions, right? It is going to be impacting hundreds of millions, right? So that's changes the dynamics, right? And this is where when all of them they produce. In fact, you'll be surprised. Government of India is focusing on moving our farmers away from rice. They've started working on various policies where they start growing more pulses, more oilseed, so that we can reduce rice. And in fact, frankly, if you ask me, as an Indian, I would not be very keen to see India exporting too much of rice. Rice is export of labor and water, period. Right. And some of the price point which we are talking about in rice, you'll be surprised to know that traders are making margin only by saving cost on logistics. So the price of rice is not even actually like, what the farmers are producing. It's just because there are certain government support they are able to take, because and then the sales is easy, right? Government by default buys wheat and rice, whatever farmer produce, and they are ready to sell. So that give them a protection. So the intention is not to act as a bad actor. It is like, a structural scenario which has evolved. So, but you rightly pointed that actually because of your close relationship with the government, the rice would be off the table of giving concession to India. Have I understood it
Yes.
right?
Yes, I think that's right. And I agree with you. We don't disagree with what India is doing to protect its rice farmers or to keep them in business, and using a minimum support price or the mandis to buy rice from farmers to then put into the public stock holding system. We're not against that at all. What we're against is the rice being exported into the world market. So as long as that rice stayed in India, we don't care what sort of subsidies or what sort of programs are provided there, as long as it stayed in the country and was used domestically for food security. It's the growth of exports by India competing with us, not in the US. You guys aren't impacting us too much in the US, as you pointed out, that it's only $50 million worth of exports to the US, but it's the other countries. It's in Africa, it's in West Africa, or it's in the Middle East or the UK, where we've seen a lot of growth in Indian exports that used to be US markets, but now we can't compete with Indian and other Asian country prices as a result of that. So I think that's our bigger complaint. It's not what you're doing to the US directly, and it's not what you're doing within your country. It's the export of cheap rice that impacts us other places, as well as the rest of the Western Hemisphere rice producers. But you mentioned a question in your question about how have shifting structures, tariff structures, and multilateral trade agreements altered North American rice. And I think we've seen a lot happening in places where we had free trade agreements. So Mexico, Central America, and the Dominican Republic, we've seen markets like that where we had exclusive duty-free access into there through our free trade agreements. But because over the last 5 or 10 years, because of anti-inflationary decrees, they opened up duty-free access to all trading partners in some cases. And so Mexico, for example, let in duty-free milled and patty rice. And so that impacted us heavily from Asia on the milled side and South America on the patty side. And we lost a lot of our market share there. In Central America, they did the same, and that impacted us from South America primarily. And then Canada has shifted a lot to Asian origin rice. And so I think we're going to rely less and less on those free trade agreements, those multilateral agreements like USMCA or CAFTA DR that we've used in the past, that have been kind of our lifeblood. And we will resort more towards countries where we have a bilateral agreement, or where, it just makes sense for US rice to be sold and we can actually compete on logistics. So Mexico, we can still compete logistically, but price wise, we're more expensive than most of our South American competition. And the same with Central America. It really depends on the year and prices, but that changing tariff structure in a lot of those countries as a result of COVID and inflation around the world on food has definitely impacted where we export rice and how we export rice.
Excellent. So, Peter, coming towards the fag end of this discussion, pretty interesting discussion, and I love the passion you are having for your farmers, because I do the same, right? I believe farmers are the most important people in the world, because end of the day, we need farmers multiple times a day. You might need an engineer, a doctor, maybe once or twice a year, but you need a farmers, the morning tea to the last supper. Like, we all need farmers, and we have to protect them, and we have to do whatever is required to protect our domestic farmers first and the global farmers. And at the same time, I also believe that farmers, whether they are in the US or in India, for me, I'm having the same passion for them. And if your government want to protect the farmers, I'm all up for it. I think I'm a big supporter of any government supporting the farmers. Now that brings to a very important pertinent question, right? Which is about the legislation. According to you, actually, in your discourse, what is the one very most important agricultural legislation which is required in US so that actually the rice farmers can be protected and they have dignity of livelihood?
Well, I guess I'll start by not answering your question, because I don't know if there's just one that is most important. I think in a typical year, we would say the Farm Bill, the US Farm Bill, and everyone hears about that. It's all of our farm safety net programs and research dollars and food nutrition programs that support our underprivileged Americans, all sorts of things in there. Because that was most of that was handled last year in President Trump's One Big Beautiful Bill last summer, then we don't really have as much in the actual farm bill that is up for debate this year. And so I would say that's not our most important legislation right now. I think we're pursuing additional economic assistance from our government right now. And last year, our rice farmers lost more than $400 per acre on rice. And so they received some government assistance in February from the administration through what's called the Farmer Bridge Assistance Program, but they still have more than $200 per acre losses uncovered. So when we have farmers, in India, we're talking about, maybe a hectare or two in most cases for farm size, but in the US, we're talking about, 2,000, 5,000 acres of land. And so $400 times 5,000 acres is a lot. That's a lot of money that is lost by those farmers, and that's just loss. So they're not making anything on it. They're losing that much money, and it's difficult for them to come back around the next year and say, I'm going to plant more rice or I'm going to plant another crop without having some sort of something there, some sort of assistance to make up some of that loss. And so we're seeking additional assistance in the next couple months for our 2025 crop to try to pay off some of our loans that we've taken. And we're also, like I mentioned earlier, and you alluded to, we're pursuing efforts to increase rice tariffs through a Section 301 investigation specific to rice. And so right now there's not any specific rice tariffs out there. There might be a tariff that is on rice, but it's just because everything from this country is hit with 10% tariff, or everything from this country is hit with 18% tariff. And so what we want to do is make sure that rice has a specific tariff on it that will help protect our domestic market a little bit more. We are very aware that we are still going to buy plenty of basmati rice. It's a premium product. It's a high value product. It's going to come in whether we have a 10% or a 50% tariff. What we don't want to come in is the regular long grain rice, from whether it's from South America or Vietnam. We don't want as much jasmine rice to come in. We grow our own jasmine. It's pretty high quality. It's not homily, but it's high quality, and it is definitely comparable in most cases. So we want to reduce some of that import demand that we have right now and shift to domestic demand. And we're hopeful that we can do that through a Section 301 investigation that results in some level of rice tariffs.
And Peter, one more very nuanced point, like, India is having a huge diaspora in the US. So generally you'll find that this $330 million worth of rice imports I was talking about, a substantial part of that goes to specified rice because the diaspora consume that regularly, especially when they are making the South Indian, the southern part of India. They have this culture of idlis and dosa, right, and which need a specific type of rice which is mixed with urad dal. So sometimes what happens is that irrespective of tariff, right, the dosa would not be made using jasmine rice. It would definitely be still be made from the rice which is being imported from India. So, but it's again, Peter, I'm totally all for, like, protecting the local farmers. I think if the consumer has to pay higher price, be it and lucky for US that actually, like, it is among the high per capita income generation country, and spending maybe a couple of dollars extra per kg of rice is not gonna hurt too much. With that thought, thanks a lot, Peter. It was a pleasure engaging with you. Be in touch if you need anything, any support, any information, right, on protecting your farmers. I'm all there to support. And thanks a lot for sparing your time and talking about very important commodity and the people behind that commodity, the rice farmers of US. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank you. So with that, we come to the end of the third session on the second day of Commodity Week World. We have a very interesting discussion with two of the most eminent voices when it comes to wheat and rice in America. And the message was very clear that we have to ensure that our farmers, irrespective of whether they're American farmers, they are Thai farmers, they are Indian farmers, they are European farmers, they are Russian farmers, or they are Ukrainian farmers, or they are African farmers. All of them, they have a dignity of livelihood. I strongly believe in that. And if whatever is required needs to be done, should be done. And with a positive thought, that looking forward that more and more farmers, right, they become prosperous and they don't have anxiety or depression, which we talked about going forward. With that, thanking all of you for joining us. Looking forward to talk to you again tomorrow, where we'll be having the first session focused on some of the topics which we just discussed, the rice in Asia and Pacific. We all know that rice is a very important crop when it comes to Asian or South Asian countries, all the way from Pakistan to India to Bangladesh to Vietnam, Thailand, Myanmar, Philippines, Indonesia. It's very important crop, and we'll be delving deep into multiple aspects with a very strong expert panel. Till then, thank you. Looking forward to see you.